Hey there, it's File with you again. Okay, so this is our last reading for Gender, Culture, and Language. Prelude to Barbershop by Vershawn Ashanti Young. And paragraph 1. While sitting in the only Black barbershop in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on the morning of writing this prelude, trying to think of the best way to acquaint you with what this book is about and who I am as the author behind it, it struck me just how different I am from a lot of other Black men. And yet again, I was compelled to acknowledge my desire to be like them. The men I observed walked with this lanky dip I wished I could perfect. They talked casually but passionately about sports, basketball especially, with the deep resonance that reverberates in my hungry ears. Many spoke a spicy Black lingo, the hip linguistics that even white kids from Iowa crave. The men wore pants that sagged. Their feet were adorned in the latest $200 sneakers endorsed by Allen Iverson or Shaq. Their self-assurance made me want to mimic them, to give a gender performance that would say unequivocally to everybody, white folks, Black folks, everybody, that I too am a Black male with balls. That's why I was at the barbershop, to get that fresh, bald fade, one of those trendy hallmarks of Black masculinity. However, because this barbershop is located smack dab in the middle of mostly white Iowa, a state that unapologetically leads in incarcerating Black men, my vicarious revel in Black masculinity was sobered by the statistics. While only 2% of those who live in Iowa are Black, Blacks comprise 25% of the state's prison population. In addition to enchantment, I felt a conflicting confusion of fortune and tribulation. Fortune, because my language and demeanor often marked me as educated, separating me from those who exemplify the stigmatized and paradoxically romanticized Black male profile, and consequently excusing me, though certainly not always, from the plight that follows that image. I am troubled because Black men who suffer most from the educational and judicial systems are poor, from the underclass, from the ghetto, like me. And although many flee the big city looking for small haven in mid-America, they sometimes find that their situation gets worse. I both identify with that predicament and disidentify with that because I am and am not exactly one of them. I both do and do not want to be. Okay, so this one kind of needs to be broken down a little bit. So even though he really wants to be part of the Black masculine experience, he lives in a state that's mostly white, where only 2% of the population are Black, but that 25% of the state's prison population, so our 25% are made up of Blacks, which is statistically saying that a lot more Blacks get arrested and imprisoned than their segment of the population would say that they should. He's also talking that he sounds, because of his language, he often sounds educated, which separates him from that ideal, sometimes romanticized ideal of the Black male machoism, where it's stigmatized for being ghetto. It's paradoxically, so in other words, strangely also romanticized or loved. So it is stigmatized or pointed out or can make you stick out because you sound this way, but it's paradoxically or weirdly, on the other hand, romanticized through song, etc., of being this Black male experience. So much so that he wants to be part of it, but he also realizes that he part wants to be one of them, he part doesn't want to be. Okay, that was strange. All right, let's try going on here. Number 3, to embrace my Blackness, by the way, the meowing in the background is Teddy, my heritage, my manliness, I identify with men who represent the ghetto. I no longer want to deny my class background or my racial experience associated with it. I identify to belong. I disidentify to escape racism, to avoid the structures that oppress Black men. Okay, so he identifies with his heritage and his both his socioeconomic background as well as his blackness, and he identifies with that, but he disidentifies it to escape openly racist structures. But I, and that's Tabby wanting somebody's attention. Okay. But I also disidentify to retaliate against Black men, to punish them for what I perceive as their efforts to disown me. So he doesn't always feel welcomed in the Black culture. So he avoids that stereotypical Black man attitude to punish them for disowning him. This ambivalence, or kind of, not quite sure, provokes me to imitate and just as often to disassociate with the Black men I envy. Both efforts fail. Neither alleviates my racial anxiety. Instead, they heighten the angst I experience or upset I experience. As a result, I'm hyper aware of how masculine I am, not, and how Black I don't act. Okay, so this is he doesn't act the way he's expected to within the racial stereotypes and what is romanticized and believed to be that racial. And he's hyper aware of how masculine he is because there's a heavy macho masculinity based in that stereotype. Okay, Paragraph 4, I can't neatly explain why my visit to the barbershop brings all this to mind and spurs my unease. I mean, the barbers are only courteous. They take me ahead of clients who come less frequently. They even call me sir, although I'm not much older than they are, and I tell them to use my first name. Still, I can't shake the way I feel. For although I know that some of my discomfort is self-induced, a consequence of not conversing much with the barbers and their customers, about their racial and gender performances and not allowing them to give their take on mine. I also know there's a reason for my worry that my experiences is not unique. Sometimes he doesn't feel comfortably having that conversation with other Black people, be it with the barbers themselves or other customers, about how they view their Blackness, how they view their gender roles. And he worries that he's not unique in this problem. Shelley Eversley aptly summarizes part of the reason for my concern in her book, The Real Negro, offering an anecdote about the time she felt uncomfortable in a Black barbershop in Baltimore. Eversley concludes that the barbershop is a racial and cultural distinction from the university campus, the site where we both trained as intellectuals and currently work as professors. Because we participate in both sites, we suffer from the conflict that exists between them. So in order to get along with the white campus and in the barbershop, we must not alter the color of our skin, but in the ways perform race in each location. The racial performances are often carried out through language, the way we communicate. Okay, so this is interesting. So both of these people teach on a basically white campus. So even though they can't change the color of their skin and they are both Black, they change the way they behave to fit in the campus white educated area and in the Black barbershop, which is much more the focal point for uh, especially Black male culture. So they act more Black in the in the barbershop, and they act more white in. This seems really weird to be saying as a white woman. Okay, so act more white in the educational session. And that racial performance that they're doing is often carried out through language and the way they communicate with others. Eversley, for instance, paragraph 6, uneasily in her barber's chair as she listened to the men discussing their plans to participate in and make a political statement during the Million Man March, in which she terms her best graduate student speak, she expressed her belief that the march perpetuated the oppression of Black women and gays. For a few seconds, the men seemed to listen, she writes, but then continued with their conversation. Prompted by her barber to persist, he whispered, "Try it again, college girl." She offered a picture of her thoughts. She explained that the sexism and homophobia of the march mirrored the logic of white supremacy. As she left, the men told her she was still 100% Black. As she made her way to campus, however, she said she felt triumphant and sad. Triumphant because though the men had read the education in her language as proof of her intimidation whiteness, she was able to shed her academic self consciousness and belong to be seen as part of the group and authentic. She was sad because when she arrived on campus, her performance of Black authenticity lost its cachet or power. She realized that the benefits she garnered in the shop were now distinct disadvantages in her life on campus. Paragraph 7. Why did Eversley feel split in two? She had become the 21st century incarnation of Du Bois' double consciousness, an embodiment of racial schizophrenia. One moment she spoke as an imitation white woman, and after a switch of tongue, she became an authentically Black one. What endowed the Barbers with the authority to make her feel race fake and then authentic? Did her linguistic or language performance really have such a transformative power? Whatever the answers to these questions are, it's clear that Eversley was compelled to contend with the consequence of her performance, the transformation of her political competence into identity ambivalence. So, in other words, to be heard in that barbershop by those Black men, she had to change her identity to be more Black and thus more identity ambivalent because she's living these two lives, campus life and the Black community life. Paragraph 8, this racial ambivalence, so not commitment to either one, is what makes me so self-conscious about being analytical of other men in the barbershop, because my linguistic or language performance is rated in relation to theirs. And not only do I feel as if my racial performance is judged, but I know my gender performance is too. Because the barbershop is a masculine space, the performance of heterosexuality is the gold standard. So they need to act like male, hyper male heterosexuals. So hyper male interested in women. Talking sufficiently Black is not enough for me to be heard. I must also speak and act acceptably masculine. This performance is even more difficult for those who are gay or are taken as gay, as I sometimes am, because we are often estranged in these spaces or removed in these spaces. Quincy Mills offers Eric as an example in this regard to his ethnography of a Black barbershop in the South Side of Chicago. Mills describes Eric as one of the regulars in the shop, but unlike other patrons, his identity is shrouded in suspicion and innuendo because the barbers and many of the customers assume that Eric is gay. As a result, unlike other regulars who become key players in the discourse community or the conversation community, Mills writes that Eric is silenced as an agenda setter. When he would initiate conversations, the men would turn away, ignore him, or patronize him for a short while and then move on to another topic. Instead of engaging Eric, they would act annoyed by his mannerisms and voice. Okay, so by your mannerisms and voice, it also reminds us of the earlier one where the person who walked differently was thrown off of a bridge. Mills doesn't describe the particulars of Eric's voice and manner, but it's conclusive that for what the others, his masculine performance is insufficiently heterosexual. So whatever his voice, he must have a lighter sounding voice, softer sounding voice, doesn't act super hyper macho. So because he's not acting that way, he is insufficiently masculine in the view of the other patrons and the barbers in that barbershop. What's interesting about the other men's perception of Eric's sexuality is it's not based on facts, but on how he acts. On this, Mills is clear. Eric never came out to me, nor to the other men, he says. There's no confirmation of his sexual identity in the months that I spent at the shop. Eric's insufficient heterosexual performance casts him outside the boundaries of Blackness because of his demeanor, the way he acts, and his speech. Mill's rights are beyond the narrow definitions of masculinity as written in that barbershop, in that Black ultra masculine area of the barbershop in Black culture. Paragraph 11, my personal history is replete with anecdotes like Eversley, and she experiences like Eric's. And I'm trying to keep them from adding up, which is why I keep my mouth closed at the barbershop. It's also why I was nervous about reading the novel I brought with me to help me pass the weight. It's not that the novel reading itself is off limits in the shop. I've seen other men read, but given my past, my profession, and my dubious masculine performance, I hesitate. Literacy habits like reading novels of a certain kind and speaking what might appear to be standard English have always made me seem more queer, more white identified, and more middle class than I am. When I fail to meet the class, gender, and racial notions of what others ascribe to me, I'm punished. In some ways, I live in a mostly white town, and being an assistant professor at a Big Ten school heightens, not lessens as I had hoped, that conflict that stems from sometimes converging, but oftentimes diverging racial and gender expectations that are held out for Black men and that we hold out for each other. So he thought that being this professor in a Big Ten school would lessen this conflict, because there are times converging, coming together, and sometimes diverging or pulling apart racial and gender expectations that are held out for Black men and that we hold out for each other. So Black men's expectations for racial and gender behaviors are different depending on where those behaviors are taking place. If it's happening on a college campus, they're expected to behave more white, less brash, less macho. It's less necessary to be super macho. Whereas if they're in the Black culture, especially in the Black culture barbershop, where it's the ultimate men's place, they are expected to act super macho, super crass, and much less educated. Okay, paragraph 13. I recognize the problem and I'm working so that it doesn't consume me. Hell, I say to encourage myself, I'm an English professor. That justifies my reading a novel in a barbershop. And what's nonsense of trying to fit in, to avoid alienation, to avoid name calling, sissy, faggot. But I wonder, what does not fitting in cost me? The issue of trying to fit in and never succeeding, of being perpetually on the margins of various communities and never finding a way to be part of any one of them, is the trope or the story of his life, making me something of a Black Sisyphus. Sisyphus was sentenced in Hades to constantly going after the thing he wants and never quite ever being able to reach it. So he can never be totally part of the academic world as a Black man, and he can never quite be part of the male-dominated macho society of that barbershop. So academic literacy is his heavy rock that he's trying to push up that hill. As you see, my Sisyphean experience in Iowa is a continuation of troubles that began when I was growing up in Chicago in the late 1970s and 80s in the notorious Governor Harry Horner homes, the same site that Alan Kolowitz writes about in his journalistic ethnography, There Are No Children Here. In fact, Kolowitz was gathering material for his book. I was still living there. But unlike his subjects, Lafayette and Farrow, who were portrayed as boys who must fight the criminalizing lure of the ghetto in order to succeed in school, I was seen as an anomaly or something that sticks out or doesn't conform. Kotlowitz sees Lafayette and Farrow as having identities compatible with the ghetto, even as he describes their striving to get out. My identity, however, was atypical, alienating me from my neighbors and the hood and excluding me from representations of authentic ghetto life. Thus, I didn't have to fight to get out of the ghetto. I was kicked out. It might seem like a good thing that I was kicked out. It might seem as if this exile expedited or hurried up the leave I was seeking. But the problem is that the bit of personal history presents, the problem that my monograph theorizes, the problem that my trip to the barbershop illustrates is because I ain't no homeboy, that I long to be and would do anything short of killing to gain that identity. I'm not ghetto enough for the ghetto, but he wants to be because that's actually what his history is. And I'm not white boy, I'm not white enough for the white folks. And because I wasn't born into the middle class, I'm not completely accepted by the mainstream. And because, if you can believe it, I'm not ghetto enough for the mainstream or the middle class enough for the ghetto or black enough for white folks. The psycho emotional pain that is liminal existence creates, this existence on the edge of everything, is the pain of negotiating multiple cultural and racial worlds. It's far too great for many. So, in other words, this pain of never fitting in anywhere, and as human beings, we strive to fit in and to belong. Some people, a lot of people can't handle it. But I've been doing it for a long time, and I have been able to cope only by transforming my personal problem into an intellectual one. So, in other words, he's taking the personal stuff that he feels and turning it into an intellectual issue and examining it that way. In some ways, I'm chipping away at the burden, but far too many are not able to do this. And why should they have to? Perhaps some black women, perhaps some black men in that barbershop are also trying to avoid racial and cultural punishment. Instead of negotiating two worlds, maybe they have chosen to live in only one, a microcosm, a subculture of white society that accepts and mandates a certain socio-linguistic performance of masculinity. So, in other words, to live in that solid culture of white society, they are required to talk, to perform speech in a way that reflects their Black masculinity. And because they've chosen or are accepted by a community, perhaps they have no need to envy me as I do them. But then why do they lose when they don't try to imitate what I represent? It's my desire to reconcile my ghetto past with my middle class aspirations and possibly be of assistance to others in the process. I want to expose the factors that make Black racial identity incompatible and it can't live at the same time as literacy, especially for males. Thus, masculine panic, racial anxiety, and the relation of language and academic literacy, so being educated, as a prescribed means for class climbing, constituent a three-part theme that I explore in this book. Okay, now this is a prelude to the book that we're not actually reading, but he's turning his life story and his own pain and his need to be accepted by the Black masculine community, as well as the white, as well as the middle class community that he also doesn't quite belong to, as well as this literate, educated community that he seems too Black to be part of. To take these three places that he lives on the edge of and try to figure out how to create a place of belonging out of that. All right, so that's our last reading for language, culture, and gender. All right, so we will see you later. Remember, if you have any questions, just ask. This was a complicated read, okay?